When it first came out in 1972, the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street was panned by some critics for its multiple musical genres and lack of hits. Today, it's considered one of the greatest rock and roll albums of all time. Now, the Stones are re-releasing Exile, and I had a chance to sit down with two iconic members of the band, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. The Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street. Some critics have called it the greatest rock album of all time. The year was 1971. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Was this that period?
This was the period.
Do you think it was a dangerous time?
Yeah, it was dangerous.
It was during this time that the Rolling Stones found themselves on the run, owing more taxes than they could pay. They fled England before the government could seize their assets.
We owed a lot of money in tax. We made all kinds of mistakes. We had some very bad advice.
Forced into exile, Mick, Keith, Charlie, and Bill made their way to the south of France, where they recorded the album in the basement of Keith Richards' rented mansion.
But it started, after a week or so, it started to sound good, and it sort of had a character of its own.
And that made the album more interesting, perhaps, and more sprawling, more eclectic, more everything.
I kind of started to feel it was special when Mick and I looked at each other and said, it's got to be a double album.
Take one.
38 years later, the album is being re-released with 10 never-before-heard tracks. First of all, how do you just keep 10 tracks secret when you're the Rolling Stones?
I think there's kind of the 6 tracks that were never released, and there's alternate versions of some of the songs.
The entire experience is captured in the documentary Stones in Exile.
The odd time you come up to the surface, they'd be partying up there. So you never knew quite what you were going to meet.
I actually wasn't particularly stoned making Exile on Main Street. I was very, very intent on making that record. I really wasn't even aware that there were movie cameras around until I saw this footage recently.
But then you could argue the other thing. Maybe you were that stoned if you didn't know there were that many people shooting the video.
Noises were coming out.
There's a scene where the guy who cooks for the Stones
he
would take off. Yeah, he would take off on Thursday so he could go to Marseille and get heroin. And as you're discussing it, there's a scene where you're there with your son, and he's blowing out his birthday candles. He can't be more than 3 or 4 years old. As a father now, in his two. Yeah. So as a father now in his 60s, when you look back, do you ever stop and think, what did I do?
It was a different time. And after all, my son is now 42 and very strong and healthy, and we had a great childhood.
Was the album greatly influenced, though, by drugs and drug use and alcohol?
In the subject material, it's not really written about that particularly. You know, there's a few odd side references. All of the music at that time was being made with that, more or less with that influence.
So this is an album where you look and say, we couldn't have made that album sober, or we couldn't have made
that you can't.
That's completely
that you can't tell. You can't ever say, would you have written that song if you'd have been sober? Well, you might have done, yeah. You could have written it sober, maybe you'd have written it drunk. That's all just hypothetical stuff. If my job is to sing or write a song over it, it doesn't matter if it's something that was done last week or something that was done 40 years ago. To be honest, it's just music. And if it holds up, it holds up.
What has held up is the relationship between these two rock and roll icons. You have a great quote that I want to read you. You say, Mick needs to know what he's going to do tomorrow. Me, I'm just happy to wake up and see who's hanging around. Mick's rock, I'm roll.
Yeah, I'll go with that. Yeah.
Is that the magic? I mean, is that really what's created this dynamic, the yin and the yang, through all these years?
Probably. It's a balance, in a way, because we're not exactly the same kind of person. And but whatever it is, when we work together, it balances out. I mean, I don't really want to go into it too much, because if I find out the secret,
you'll mess it up.
Yeah, it might grow up, you know.
And yes, I ended our interview by asking Mick the same question I ask him every time I interview him. Are the Stones going back on tour? His answer, no concrete plans, but he would love to. And by the way, the re-released Exile on Main Street comes out tomorrow, followed by the DVD on June 22nd.